Buongiorno a tutte, buongiorno a tutti. Un caloroso benvenuto da parte dell'Università di Padova, nell'Aula Magna Galileo Galilei, qui a Palazzo del Bo, e anche un benvenuto a tutti gli utenti online che seguono la cerimonia in streaming. Inizia in questo momento appunto la cerimonia di conferimento della laurea magistrale ad honorem in Medicina e Chirurgia al professor Christopher Fletcher, che siamo lieti di ospitare nel nostro Ateneo. Vi ringrazio molto per la vostra presenza. La cerimonia si avvia con l'ingresso in aula magna del corteo accademico. Vi chiedo cortesemente di alzarvi in piedi. Il corteo accademico è composto da felucati, docenti togate e togati dell'Università di Padova, delegate e delegati della magnifica rettrice, prorettrici e prorettori. È composto dal presidente della Scuola di Medicina e Chirurgia, nonché professore proponente della laurea ad honorem, dal direttore del Dipartimento di Medicina, dal laureando ad honorem e, in chiusura, dalla magnifica rettrice. Potete accomodarvi, grazie. Inauguriamo questa cerimonia con un messaggio pervenuto alla magnifica rettrice dal Presidente della Regione del Veneto. Magnifica rettrice, ringraziandola per il cortese invito, mi duole davvero comunicare che non potrò presenziare alla cerimonia odierna. Desidero però con la presente esprimere il mio plauso e la mia vicinanza a questa occasione, organizzata dall'Ateneo Patavino, per omaggiare l'operato profuso dal professor Fletcher nell'ambito della ricerca medica e scientifica. Il conferimento odierno dimostra inequivocabilmente che la lotta al tumore non deve conoscere barriere, né linguistiche né geografiche. Considero questo aspetto lo stimolo più importante che la cerimonia può donarci. La scienza parla infatti un linguaggio universale, abbatte barriere, costruisce ponti di conoscenza e dialogo, valori alti ben rappresentati dallo storico Ateneo Patavino. Ringraziando quindi l'Università di Padova per l'impegno dimostrato, voglio ricevere il mio cordiale saluto ed estenderlo a tutti i presenti e a ciascuna autorità partecipante. Dottor Luca Zaia. E dopo questo primo augurio prende la parola proprio la magnifica rettrice dell'Università di Padova, Daniela Mappelli, per la lettura della laudatio del professor Fletcher.
Care colleghe, colleghi, autorità, studentesse e studenti, cari ospiti qui presenti. La comunità accademica patavina è orgogliosa di poter celebrare oggi il professor Christopher Fletcher, figura di grande spicco nel campo della medicina, già noto al nostro Ateneo, vista la sua collaborazione trentennale con l'anatomia patologica della nostra università. Un rapporto maturato non solo attraverso una stretta connessione di ricerca scientifica focalizzata in generale sui tumori rari e in particolare sulle neoplasie mesenchimali, ma anche nello svolgimento di innumerevoli iniziative formative realizzate in Italia e all'estero. Una collaborazione che ha sicuramente contribuito ad accrescere il prestigio internazionale dell'anatomia patologica padovana. Caro professor Fletcher, l'Università di Padova ha ormai una riconosciuta tradizione di eccellenza nel campo della medicina. Basti ricordare, fra gli altri, grandi scienziati quali Andrea Vesaglio, Gabriele Falloppio e Giambattista Morgagni, padre fondatore, quest'ultimo, dell'anatomia patologica. Eccellenti medici che hanno introdotto la dissezione del corpo umano come strumento per capire la funzione e per studiare le basi delle malattie. Mi fa piacere, professor Fletcher, pensare di poterle conferire la laurea ad honorem in questa prestigiosa aula magna che si trova a pochi metri di distanza da un luogo altamente iconico per l'intera storia ed evoluzione della medicina. Il primo teatro anatomico permanente costruito al mondo. Era il 1595, quando fu completata la sua realizzazione. Venne pensato e costruito al termine di quello che fu un secolo aureo, il Cinquecento, per gli studi anatomici. In città, a Padova, a quell'epoca, insegnarono grandi maestri come il già citato Vesaglio, che dall'esperienza di Padova ha tratto il suo capolavoro De Humani Corporis Fabrica, pubblicato nel 1543, e Gabriele Falloppio, Girolami Fabrici d'acqua pendente, al quale si deve la realizzazione del teatro. Caro professor Fletcher, secoli dopo, il nostro teatro anatomico continua a testimoniare l'importanza di quell'epoca straordinaria, anni in cui hanno scelto Padova per i loro studi scienziati da tutto il mondo. Fra questi, ad esempio, William Harvey, che avrebbe scoperto la circolazione del sangue ispirato proprio dai suoi studi patavini. Mi piace pensare il suo lavoro, professor Fletcher, idealmente collegato a queste figure di medici scienziati che continuano ad ispirarci ancora oggi. E mi permetta, vorrei ricordare, con una punta di orgoglio, quanto detto e scritto dallo storico della medicina Giorgio Cosmacini. La nascita della medicina moderna risulta registrata all'anagrafe di Padova. Nella nostra città, che a quei tempi era più popolosa di Londra, grazie ai tantissimi studenti che ospitavamo, la medicina cambia infatti volto. Dall'impostazione filosofica di Galeno si passa all'osservazione costante dei fenomeni da indagare e nasce così la medicina moderna. Ma torniamo al presente. Lei, Christopher Fletcher, dal 1995 è full professor alla Harvard University e dirige la divisione di anatomia patologica del Brigham and Women's Hospital, istituzione sanitaria della prestigiosa Harvard Medical School di Boston. Formatosi al St. Thomas Hospital di Londra, ha svolto nella stessa istituzione la sua attività clinica e di ricerca dal 1982 fino alla chiamata a Harvard, avvenuta appunto nel 1995. Lei, professor Fletcher, rappresenta a livello mondiale la figura di maggior rilievo in ambito della patologia oncologica. In particolare, lei ha rivoluzionato l'approccio diagnostico ai tumori mesenchimali, integrando morfologia e genetica molecolare. Nell'ambito della sua attività di ricerca ha scoperto numerose nuove entità tumorali. Ciò ha permesso spesso di identificare approcci terapeutici innovativi. Dal 2000 a oggi ha coordinato il gruppo di lavoro incaricato di riformulare la classificazione V delle neoplasie mesenchimali. In ragione delle sue eccezionali capacità diagnostiche è diventato un punto di riferimento per le colleghe e i colleghi di tutto il mondo, offrendo il suo parere esperto in casi di particolare difficoltà diagnostica. Nel corso della sua carriera lei ha ricoperto importanti cariche istituzionali, compresa quella di presidente della prestigiosissima United States and Canadian Academy of Pathology, ed è stato insignito dei più ambiti riconoscimenti accademici sia negli Stati Uniti che in Europa e in Asia. Al di là dei suoi indiscussi meriti scientifici, vi dico solo che il professor Fletcher è autore di più di 700 lavori scientifici e ha un H-index di 140, nonché curatore del testo di anatomia patologica maggiormente diffuso. Lei, caro professore, è un mentore di pressore straordinario, capace di formare, ispirare e indirizzare intere generazioni di patologi. Da sempre è un docente di qualità superlativa ed è stato protagonista di innumerevoli eventi formativi in tutte le parti del mondo. Il conferimento della laurea in Medicina e Chirurgia ad honorem costituisce un giusto riconoscimento a un collega che ha saputo interpretare in modo ineguagliabile il ruolo di medico, scienziato, mentore e formatore. Benvenuto tra noi, Christopher David Marsden Fletcher.
ora il professor Angelo Dei Tos, presidente della Scuola di Medicina e Chirurgia, darà lettura delle motivazioni del conferimento della laurea magistrale ad honorem in Medicina e Chirurgia a Christopher Fletcher. Conferimento istituito e deliberato dal Dipartimento di Medicina, diretto dal professor Roberto Vettor.
Magnifica rettrice, gentili colleghe e colleghi, studenti e studentesse, autorità, signore e signori, il Dipartimento di Medicina dell'Università di Padova propone di conferire al professor Christopher Fletcher la laurea in Medicina e Chirurgia. In primo luogo ringrazio di cuore sia il direttore del Dipartimento di Medicina, Roberto Vettor, che la magnifica rettrice professoressa Mapelli per aver consentito e supportato questa nomina e questo momento. Come già detto, Chris Fletcher rappresenta da tempo il vertice assoluto dell'anatomia patologica mondiale, scienziato, docente, educatore e mentore insuperabile. Come anche poi descritto nella pergamena, egli ha veramente rivoluzionato l'approccio alla diagnosi dei tumori mesenchimali, in una prospettiva di costruzione poi di percorsi terapeutici innovativi. Le nuove entità tumorali che ci ha costretto a studiare sono circa 40 e, come già citato, questi 700 lavori scientifici hanno arricchito come mai nessuno nella storia della nostra disciplina il campo della patologia oncologica mesenchimale. In questo campo così complesso non esiste patologo al mondo che di fronte ad un caso di complessa interpretazione non si sia rivolto a lui per acquisire il suo parere. Questa è un'attività della quale hanno sicuramente beneficiato i colleghi e le colleghe che si sono a lui affidati, ma soprattutto quelle decine di migliaia di pazienti, sono credo 125.000 in realtà, in tutto il mondo, ai quali una diagnosi accurata ha consentito di intraprendere il percorso terapeutico più appropriato. Chris Fletcher ha impresso nella storia dell'anatomia patologica un marchio indelebile ed ha contribuito in modo decisivo a rendere la nostra disciplina, che è fatta di laboratori ma non è medicina di laboratorio perché è una disciplina clinica, la resa centrale in quel complesso ambito che è il processo diagnostico e terapeutico. Se poi mi è consentito un cenno personale, questa giornata, questa laurea d'onore, oltre a riconoscere le altissime qualità scientifiche ed umane del professor Fletcher, suggella un viaggio personale comune di 34 anni, certo un viaggio ricco di collaborazioni scientifiche, ma soprattutto nutrito da una profonda stima ed amicizia. Grazie.
Ed ora invito sul podio la magnifica rettrice dell'Università di Padova, Daniela Mapelli. Per la proclamazione e il conferimento del titolo di dottore invito il professor Fletcher ad alzarsi in piedi.
Repubblica Italiana in nome della legge. Noi, professoressa Daniela Mapelli, rettrice dell'Università degli Studi di Padova. Vista la deliberazione del Dipartimento di Medicina dell'Università di Padova del 29 aprile 2021, nella quale si propone di conferire a Christopher David Marsden Fletcher, nato a Huddersfield, Regno Unito, il 13 marzo 1958, la laurea magistrale ad honorem in Medicina e Chirurgia. Visto il DM 270 del 22 ottobre 2004, visto il DM 16 marzo 2007, con il quale sono state determinate le classi di laurea magistrale, visto il regolamento per il conferimento dei titoli di laurea e di dottorato ad honorem dell'Università degli Studi di Padova, emanato con decreto rettorale numero 144-461 del 13 marzo 2019, vista l'approvazione del Ministero dell'Università e della Ricerca con lettera protocollata numero 21241 del 27 settembre 2022, conferiamo a Christopher David Marsden Fletcher la laurea magistrale ad honorem in Medicina e Chirurgia e gli rilasciamo il presente diploma a tutti gli effetti di legge. Padova, AD 10 maggio 2023.
Il momento simbolico del conferimento del diploma e della posa della medaglia del laureato lo accompagniamo con un meritato applauso, secondo meritato applauso. Ed ora il professor Fletcher, neodottore all'Università di Padova, farà la sua lectio magistralis.
Well, thank you for this enormous, tremendous honor. It's quite overwhelming for the moment. English people are not easily overwhelmed, but Descartes told me this would be a very simple thing. He said, don't worry, it's easy. And then 3 months ago, he said, by the way, no slides, no notes. Please be a little historical, philosophical. And then yesterday he told me, and you have to be inspirational also. I thought, what do you want me to do, like jump over the moon or something? Anyway, it's very kind of you to arrange the London weather for me, Paolo de Tos. I feel sort of at home. I thought I would be brave and try and talk about history of pathology a little bit and how it's affected me. It's very difficult to talk about history in an environment like this where most of pathology was born, yes, because you all know more history than I do. But many of you who are pathologists in the room and anatomists will know that really the first attempt at identifying disease was just ordinary physicians actually here in Italy in the 15th century beginning to do autopsies on people who died with no idea really what the cause was. And then came here Vesalius from, I think he was Flemish, from the sort of border between Belgium and the Netherlands nowadays, and started the first serious anatomy. And then Giovanni Morgani, of course, the first true anatomical pathologist, and his amazing work, De Sedibus, with the 70 letters that he wrote describing in detail all these autopsies that he'd done and the anatomic correlations of the diseases that he found. Sorry, thank you. It was some while, actually, before pathologists began to use microscopes. They didn't use microscopes until the 19th century. And at that time, autopsy pathology was supposed to be the most important thing. Rokitansky and Virchow, who were doing most of their work in Germany, and people from other countries would go to learn in Germany about pathological anatomy. It's funny, actually, I won a prize in medical school in morbid anatomy, and I told my mother I got a prize in morbid anatomy. And she went, "Ew, what is morbid anatomy?" It was quite funny. Then, towards the late 19th century, people began to think about whether they could diagnose diseases in real time. And real time meant within a few weeks of the surgery, not at the time that you had an operation, but people mostly were doing research on the tissue. They weren't using it to help care for the patient. And that didn't really happen until the 20th century. And while there were well-established pathologists here in Europe, in the USA, the people who were doing the pathology, diagnostic pathology there, were all surgeons. And surgeons did most of this until around the beginning of the Second World War, so until around 1940. And you can imagine that scientists did not have a high opinion of surgeons, yes? And surgeons then became anatomic pathologists. So there's always been this gap between scientists and the people who diagnose things ever since then. It's quite amusing. Every big academic department of pathology in the USA has about 8 or 10 neuropathologists. They have no cases to look at. I mean, they have a few cases to look at, but it's the most special specialty, the one where they study the brain, so they're very important. And it always makes me smile. But usually they have to have grants, otherwise they have no job. True pathologists by training did not really emerge until the 1930s, and actually in America was the first place where they had board examinations for pathologists in the late 1930s. And the main centers where anatomic pathology was practiced were Johns Hopkins, the Mayo Clinic, and Memorial Sloan Kettering, where the famous James Ewing of Ewing sarcoma fame was working. And then pathology grew quite rapidly and began even to subspecialize in the 1950s. There was hematopathology, neuropathology, they had their own exams. And this progressed over a period of 30 years. And I was lucky enough to start in pathology in the early 1980s, when cytogenetics was just being applied to clinical diagnosis for tumors, not just for unusual babies and congenital disorders and so on. And actually, I learned all my cytogenetics from a graduate of this university, a delightful, crazy Italian woman called Paola Dalcin, who was working in Leuven at the time. And we managed to recruit her to the department in Boston in the late 1990s. And she's still crazy, and she's still very good, probably the best in the world. And then, of course, in the 1990s came molecular genetics, a chance to use yet more techniques to enhance our diagnoses, and then finally genomic medicine in 2000 onwards. And it was predicted at the time that the human genome was sequenced that nobody would need pathologists anymore. Everybody decided, oh, if you can find the genetic defect in the tumor, then we know what it is, we know how to treat it. None of this proved to be true. Instead, all of these technologies have made pathology more sophisticated, but we still use microscopes even now. And it makes people look at us as if we're rather old-fashioned, which can be a problem. We'll come back to that. But I was thinking, because Datos forced me to think about this, why I went into pathology, and I realized I had amazing teachers in medical school. And I actually liked surgery and internal medicine just as much, but I discovered I loved pathology. And so I went into the field of pathology. Now, my father was a surgeon, and he was not impressed. For the surgeon in the 1970s, 80s, he had two servants, the anesthesiologist and the pathologist, yes? Put the patient to sleep, tell me the diagnosis, and you just stand there with your big knife, yes? In my experience, surgeons have not changed too much in the last 50 years. But that's okay, because now you can give as good as you get, yes? You just stand up for yourself. Anyway, he was not very impressed, I don't think. And I started working initially in London at St. Thomas's, one of the older hospitals in the center of London. Not quite as old as Padova. I think it was founded in maybe 13, something young, you know, much younger than here. And became interested in soft tissue tumors because I had a colleague who was asked to write a review article about soft tissue tumors for a journal. And he was too lazy, so he went to find a junior trainee, say, who wants to write this article and I can help me? And I said, oh, I'll do it. And it turned into 4 articles, and I discovered it's because I loved the soft tissue tumors. And I realized just recently I received my very first case in consultation in 1985 when I was a 3rd-year resident, so it was crazy. It was very surreal. Anyway, so the consultations grew, my interest grew, the academic productivity grew. And then came Margaret Thatcher. You remember Margaret Thatcher? Anyway, she was a problem because she decided that special bits of the National Health Service in England, if other hospitals need to send cases to a central hospital for a diagnosis, then the first hospital should pay, except the first hospital has no money to pay, yes, because it's a socialized system. There is no money for this kind of thing. And so she picked 3, well, not she, her Minister of Health, whose name I've forgotten. No, I have not forgotten. She was called Virginia Bottomley, horrible woman, but anyway. And she decided, they picked 3 things. They picked my little soft tissue tumor unit at St. Thomas's, a bone marrow transplant unit for children at the Westminster Hospital in London, and some special ophthalmic thing that I don't know anything about eyes. Eyes are too difficult. It's all to do with physics. They picked these 3 centers and they told us you must now send a bill every time you receive a case for a consultation. You send a bill to the other hospital. And you can imagine people were very, very angry. They'd never seen a bill before. And then they said, we are members of European Community. please also send bills to people in the European community who send cases. So it was quite funny because the English pathology departments became very angry and thought I was some crazy, rude, aggressive, horrible man trying to get money. And the European department said, and just tore the bill and threw it away. Yes, they just ignored it, which was perfect. But it was very stressful, as you may imagine. It was in the television, in the newspaper, and so on. And then around that time, a very famous pathologist from the US called Ramsey Cotran came to London. Well, he was visiting London to visit family, but he asked if he could meet with me, and then he tried to persuade me to come to Boston, and that was in about 1992. And I first visited in 93 and eventually started work in Boston in 1995. And truthfully, I've had the most astonishing career because of the opportunities that were provided to me. And the inspirational thing, inspiration, Paulo de Tarso, I promised you I'd talk about inspiration. He's very demanding, you know, this just, was suddenly discovering there were all these unbelievably clever trainees. Most of the trainees were far cleverer than I was, and you could work with them and they would give you new ideas because they were so clever. And there were so many wonderful people to work with. And the work blossomed, and anyway, so in the end, I think we changed the classification of soft tissue tumors. I think we described almost 40 new tumor types now with the genetics and everything, and had a lot of fun doing it. But now we reached an interesting time in pathology, which is what I wanted to talk about for some minutes, because in Padua, you probably will not believe this, because in Padua you have such a strong tradition in pathology. But in most places around the world, in Europe, even in Japan, certainly in America, the amount of pathology in the medical school curriculum gets less and less each year because they add more things like social medicine and so on that you have to work to learn about. So there are less and less hours of pathology. Most medical schools in the USA now no longer have an actual pathology course. Instead, they include pathology in, if you have a lecture on myocardial infarction by a cardiologist, then some tame pathologist will come and show a picture of dead heart muscle, and then that's all the teaching they get for the myocardial infarction. And because there is less pathology in medical school, the medical students are not exposed to pathologists in the same way as we all were. And so fewer and fewer people apply for pathology jobs when they graduate from medical school. To the point that now in the United Kingdom, in Sweden, and in Germany, there's a big shortage of pathologists. They have to hire pathologists from other countries because the people trained in those countries do not go into pathology anymore. And right now, anybody in this room who is a clinician or a diagnostician knows that pathology reports provide more information, more detail, more help in guiding the treatment of patients than ever before, at the same time as clinicians not really understanding what we do anymore. And so now we have become like the Wizard of Oz. We come out from behind the curtain and we say, oh, it's a whatever. We have one medical oncologist in the Dana-Farber Institute who I like to tease the whole time because he just is easy to tease. And I say, oh, George, this is a typical example of monophasic synovial sarcoma. It doesn't matter what that is. And he says, but how do you know? And I said to him, well, how do you recognize your wife when you go home? I mean, how is your wife different from the neighbor's wife or the other neighbor's wife? This is how I know. It's the same thing. Nothing, just practice. But now there is this sense that people have difficulty in accepting what is a subjective opinion. When we interpret slides with ancillary techniques, including genetics, we still rely on the initial morphology down the microscope, and people think this is so old-fashioned. The hospital administrators say to me, why have you not been modernized? Why cannot this be automated? Why do you need people to cut sections like they did, with a microtome 100 years ago? And I said, because nobody found a better way to do it. It is the standard of care. But people now have great admiration for modern technologies and believe that they are more objective and black and white, things where they can get yes and no answers. But it's not so simple. As any pathologist in this room knows, there is very little in life, actually anybody in life who's a certain age knows nothing is black and white. Everything is gray, like the sky today. Anyway, so I think this is hard because now what we do is the single most important thing, I believe, in guiding the treatment of patients with cancer especially. It's become a very cancer-centric phenomenon. So I think we as pathologists have a responsibility. These are the sort of goals and opportunities we have in the years to come. We need, not in Padua, because in Padua pathology seems to be safe because you have a lot of teaching, but even in some medical schools in Italy, they don't have as much pathology as here. We need somehow to attract more people to the specialty, to expose them to the importance of pathology. We have to teach clinicians the importance of what we do. So sometimes the pathologist has to be the aggressive one, not the surgeon. I discovered you can do it with a nice smile. You say, "You didn't know what that is? You never heard of this tumor before? Oh, I thought you were a doctor." You can get your own back a little bit, yes, see, and you make them feel bad. It's great. It's good to make surgeons feel bad sometimes. It makes the ego shrink a tiny bit. But we have to somehow get people re-engaged, to educate also the public. Most of the public walking the streets of Padua right now don't know what we do or how we do it either. The clinician says to the patient, "Oh, we're waiting to hear from the lab." Waiting to hear from the lab means waiting to hear what Datos thinks the tumor is. It doesn't mean there's a machine that's going up and down. Actually, the funniest example of this, 3 years ago in the Brigham and Women's fancy academic hospital, I was paged. What's the word in Italian for paging? You understand what I mean? I can't hear you, so it doesn't matter, I'm deaf. By a young surgeon, a trainee surgeon, who said, "We took out a patient's colon at 9 o'clock this morning. It is already noon. Where is the result?" And anybody who knows about pathology knows you have to process the tissue and you have to put it through chemicals and then you cut the sections and it takes days. You can't do it just like that. And I said, "Oh, you didn't learn any pathology in medical school, did you?" And then I was not very nice to him because I was so shocked, but I invited him to come and see. But we have to get beyond this. I think pathology is so important. That's why I feel so honored today to have this special degree, because I think pathologists often are not noticed in what they do, which is okay. I don't need to be applauded, but we need to recognize how important pathology is. And places like this should lead the way in Italy to say the other medical schools do it like we do it, because pathology here is still strong. And I hope it will stay strong everywhere for as long as I'm alive, which probably won't be that long, so I hope it will be longer than that. Yes, maybe a few more 100 years until technology finally wins. Artificial intelligence will not win, by the way, because you can only train AI to recognize common diseases where you give them thousands and thousands of examples. But there are not thousands and thousands of identical difficult lesions of different places, different organs, you can't train them to recognize everything. At least this is my belief. I am probably naive, like an old man. Anyway, I'll shut up now. That's enough about pathology. But thank you again very, very much. I'm very, very honored. Thank you.
Grazie al professor Fletcher, ed ora la cerimonia si conclude con il canto dell'inno goliardico, il Gaudeamus Igitur, eseguito dal Concentus Musicus Patavinus dell'Ateneo di Padova, oggi diretto dal maestro Antonio Bortolami. Vi chiedo di alzarvi in piedi.
Sumus,
The School of Medicine. So when you graduated from medicine, you wear this cap. So you have to change your cap.
Ogni laurea che si rispetti finisce con uno scherzo goliardico. Ringraziamo i goliardi e la tribuna che ha portato al professor Fletcher la corona d'alloro, un papiro di laurea e ovviamente la feluca con i colori della scuola di medicina e qualche altro scherzetto. L'allegro chirurgo, non so come, se in America si usa questo gioco, ma comunque è quello che i goliardi hanno pensato per il professor Fletcher. Un applauso anche ai goliardi che sono sempre molto disponibili. La cerimonia si conclude con questo momento festoso, le foto di rito. Ringraziamo tutti i presenti nell'Aula Magna Galileo Galilei, tutti coloro che ci hanno seguito in streaming e buon proseguimento di giornata. Grazie. Il Dipartimento di Medicina offre a tutti un brindisi per questa cerimonia ad honorem, un buffet che si tiene ora in Basilica. Siete tutti invitati. Grazie.